Okay, thank you very much, Andreas, and thanks for everybody who joins this meeting. Yeah, so today I will talk about the conflict dynamics in northern Somalia, and particularly the situation in and around Lasanod and this new formed Solsanak and Ain administration, with a focus, as much as I know about it at the moment, about the humanitarian situation and also the larger politics in the region in northern Somalia. And I think it's timely because at the moment, this is in a way my current insight. I mean, at the moment, the political situation in northern Somalia is really in flux. So I think it is as new or dynamic as it's more dynamic than it has been in the last minimum 20 years, I would say. So I think it's a significant political development which I'm talking about. It has, in my perception, also an influence on what's going on in the rest of Somalia. So it's not just a local event, but it's really something significant in northern Somalia and also for the rest of Somalia. Before I'm going into the details of this conflict around Lasanod and the formation of the SSC administration, I will briefly talk about the historical and political background of this conflict, because according to my long-standing research in the region, this conflict, which escalated militarily in 2023, has literally 30 years prehistory, so to say. And I mean, almost everyone who's in the room, I think, has a relatively good understanding of the situation in northern Somalia. However, just to rehearse it briefly, so when the civil war in northern Somalia started in the 1980s, so in the territorium, which is today Somaliland, particularly in central Somaliland, Hargeisa, Burao, which you see on the map here, this was really the area where the fight of the Somali national movement against the military dictatorship under President Mohamed Siad Barre took place from the early 1980s onwards. It reached a peak in 1988 when the Somali National Army bombarded the cities of Hargeisa and Burao, destroying a huge part of this towns, killing thousands of inhabitants and making hundreds of thousands refugees. And in alliance with the Somali Patriotic Movement and the United Somali Congress, two other rebel movements, the SNM finally toppled the military dictatorship of Mohamed Siad Barre, who of course had his stronghold in the south, in Mogadishu, and then further south also in Gedo region and so on. So in the south, actually, the SPM and the USC were fighting. In the north, the SNM was fighting. And in 1991, in January, the dictatorship fell and Mohamed Siad Barre fled from Mogadishu. And this was actually the moment where the future of Somalia could have taken really a different direction, because previously in 1989 and 1990, the three rebel movements, SNM, SPM, and USC, had entered into an agreement about the reshaping or reordering of Somalia after the military dictatorship. However, I mean, when Mogadishu was taken over by SPM and particularly USC fighters, the rebels couldn't agree on a new government, and within relatively short time, the SSC particularly splintered, and it became factions, Ali Mahdi, Mohammed Farah Haidit, and they were fighting over the power in the center. There was also, looting and mass murdering ongoing in Mogadishu and surroundings. And, in this time, the SNM, which had already, gone through years of civil war in the Northwest, they sent a mission to the South, looking at the situation and trying to figure out if they could build a new Somali government. And I think the mission came back to northern Somalia in February, March 1991, with the message that the South is actually on the verge of breaking down, collapsing, and there is no future in the alliance between the different rebel groups. And I think in this context, the idea came up. The idea was already around, but the idea took really shape, or gained momentum to separate northwestern Somalia from the rest of Somalia. And the separation took, of course, place in line with the different colonial histories of the area. So the Northwest was a British protectorate until 1960, 26th of June 1960, and the Northeast and the south of Somalia were Italian administrated until 1st of July 1960, and on 1st of July, both the British and the Italian territories united to form the Somali Republic. And in 1991, against the backdrop of the newly escalating war in the south, people in the Northwest obviously took the decision to separate as Somaliland from collapsing Somalia. The problem, and there really lies one of the root causes of the conflict in Lasanod today, the problem was that even then, in early 1991, not all the people in the region were on the same page when it came to, political analysis, to political emotions, to the political visions. People in what you can see on this map in Audal region, and also people in these contested territories between Puntland and Somaliland, in large parts of Seoul, Eastern Sanak, and parts of Southeastern Tokde. I mean, where mostly Dulbahante, Warsangili, and others live. And these people in Audal in the far west, and people in Seoul, Sanak, and around Buhat in the far east, they had actually been opposing the Somali national movement throughout the 1980s. They had been siding mostly with Mohammed Siad Barre's dictatorship, or at least they had kept some kind of neutral distance from those political actors in those days. So these actors were not full-heartedly supporting the idea of separating from Somalia. However, the SNM, which was mostly supported by the Isaaq population, which is demographically dominant in northwestern Somalia, the SNM was the strongest political power. And in May 1991, at the meeting in Burao, a peace meeting in Burao, the point on the agenda was, apart from making peace between the various militias in the region, to separate from Somalia. And given the military strengths and also the demographic strengths of the SNM/Isaaq, this decision was taken, and Somaliland was declared as an independent state on 18th of May 1991. If you go back, I mean, I have not been around in those days. Maybe some of you have been around. If you go back, I mean, to the literature about the beginnings of Somaliland, it was, it was not a place where you would imagine that it's going to be flourishing. So it had hardly any infrastructure. It had been devastated by civil war. The United Nations and the Americans and other international actors who became concerned about the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Somalia, they were actually completely ignoring Somaliland. The focus of the international community was soon Mogadishu and south and partly central Somalia, for humanitarian aid and for peace missions. And the UN actively ignored and even undermined Somaliland as an independent political entity. So there was no recognition for Somaliland, not within Somalia, not within the region, not within the international community. The area had very little infrastructure. I mean, it's mostly pastoral nomadic land. It's, the port of Berbera existed, of course, already, but otherwise there was hardly any infrastructure. And then within a relatively short time, the SNM started to fight each other. So different SNM units, which very often overlapped with Isaaq subclans, started to fight each other over the few resources in the area, port of Berbera, the airport in Hargeisa. And quite a few people actually were killed or injured or also became displaced until the mid-1990s. And I think in those days, the people in the far west and in the far east, they actually were not thinking that Somaliland would have a future. So I think, you could already, if you go back through oral history, you would realize that in 1993, for instance, the Dulbahante, who predominantly live between Buhat, Lasanod, and Telech, they had a small meeting in a very small place called Boame, which is not far from Garowe. This meeting was in a way countering some other meeting which happened at the same time in Boroma in the far west of Somaliland, where actually after some conflict within the SNM, a new peace agreement was forged, and the constitution, the preliminary constitution of Somaliland was established in Boroma 1993. At the same time, the Dulbahante were holding a small meeting in Boame, which clearly signaled actually that they didn't want to be part of what's going to be decided in the far west of Somaliland. So they were not, I mean, this was a small group, but it was a significant group of Dulbahante who in a way signaled that they don't want to be part of Somaliland. However, in those days, it was not really a big issue because Somaliland was so frail anyway that even in the center, the political actors needed really to focus on stabilizing the situation in Hargeisa, in Berbera, let alone Burao. So, Somaliland was just, Somaliland supporters, Somaliland politicians were just busy to keep the de facto state or the, not recognized state going. And there was no capacity to be concerned about opposition to Somaliland anywhere outside of the Isaac territories. The Dulbahante sent some delegation to Borma, indeed. I mean, here's one of the comments. Dulbahante sent some delegation to Borma, indeed. And actually, I think people like Yasin Faraton, who is currently now the Speaker of the Parliament in Hargeisa, he was part of this delegation to Borma. However, the oral history which I collected during my field research from 2002 onwards was that those sent to Boroma were actually in a way scouts to look what was ongoing, what the Isaac and the others were doing about Somaliland, but a more heavyweight presentation of the clan members was in Boroma, where also traditional leaders were present, and where clearly also diaspora actors from the near diaspora in Nairobi were present, and were really trying to direct Dulbahante into another direction, away from Somaliland into something which is, a future project for Somalia. Now we zoom a little bit fast forward. Somaliland remained relatively frail throughout the 1990s. There was a clan proportional way of sharing power, which included, of course, Dulbahante, Warsangili, Gadabursi, and of course, various Isaac clans from the center. So roughly you could say 60% of the power was in the hand of Isaac, which is also in accordance with the demography of the area. And the other 40% were divided between the non-Isaac groups. I mean, this is just very rough, but this was a formula of power sharing which found the acceptance of many people in the region. However, I would argue that it's one thing to share power in a region, and the other thing is to share a political vision. So I would think that according to my information, which I collected on the ground in various parts of the north, that Dulbahante rarely, if ever, were the political vision of Somaliland as a separate state. There were very few Dulbahante who had some kind of reputation, who full-heartedly said, I feel as part of Somaliland, I'm a Somalilander. Some people went to Hargeisa in order to participate in the power sharing. Also, traditional authorities and others in the regions in the east, so Sanak and Ain, they accepted the participation of clan members in Hargeisa because, that's what I heard then from 2002 onwards. They said they wanted to know what's ongoing in the center. So we have basically our spies in Hargeisa to tell us what's ongoing, to be part of the political processes in Hargeisa in the center of Somaliland. But the idea was not really to full-heartedly and sincerely become part of Somaliland as a political project. So when I was on the ground in 2002 and afterwards in Lasanod, the first time I was in Hargeisa, I heard all the story about the Somali national movement, how Siad Barre used to punish the Isaac, how the rebels resisted the dictatorship, and how they were eventually victorious after a lot of sacrifice. and how peace was rebuilt in Somaliland. And, in the early 2000s, there was also the transition from a clan proportional way of power sharing to a multi-party system. So I was on the ground in a way when the multi-party system and with it democratization was introduced in Somaliland. And of course, the narrative in Hargeisa was we liberated ourselves from dictatorship, we reclaimed our colonial territory, and we are currently not only successfully building peace, but even democracy. So, why doesn't the international community recognize us? So I went to Lasanod in mid-2002, and I was really astonished how different the narrative was there. You could see Somali flags on the walls, murals, and you would hear about the Darawish history, which was, a movement, an anti-colonial movement, which started around 1899 against the British and also actually the Ethiopian colonial powers in the region, the Ethiopians who under Menelik II had occupied what is today the region 5 or Ogaden region of Ethiopia, which is Somali inhabited. So the Ethiopians and the British were considered colonial occupiers of the Somali territories by the Darawish, who were led by an Ogaden Sheikh called Mohammed Abdel Hassan, who was born from a Dulbahante mother around Buhotle. And Buhotle, which you can see on the map, is also the birthplace of the Darawish movement. It's important to note that actually, historically speaking, not only Dulbahante were part of Darawish, but also various Isaac groups, also Macherten, and I think even some Hawi eventually, at least further south, eventually joined the Darawish movement. So it was definitely not just a Dulbahante movement. There were even several Dulbahante families who did not join the Darawish, who were actively opposing it or who were keeping a neutral position. But when I came to Lasanod in 2002, most people in Lasanod, who like 99.9% are Dulbahante, would tell me we have been Darawish. So we were always oppositional to the colonizers, we were oppositional to the British. And this meant in 2002, we are also oppositional to Somaliland, which is in a way a colonial construct dominated by the Isaac, who have been the good friends of the British. This is, of course, not true historically speaking, but this was like the line of argumentation in Lasanod. So they were claiming the Darawish history in order to take an anti-colonial stand and in order to position themselves in the early 21st century against Somaliland. In Hargeisa, you had a pretty much opposed narrative, which was focusing on the SNM, and of course developed a positive perspective on the British colonialism. If you look carefully in the history of the region, you would realize that, first of all, also not all Isaac were SNM, and that actually anti-colonialism was an extremely strong sentiment, a strong movement in central Somaliland among Isaac in the 1940s and 1950s. So after the Second World War, and then well into the 1950s, very many vocal Isaac intellectuals, poets, politicians were actually trying to get rid of the British administration. And there was a big celebration when eventually the British agreed to give independence to the protectorate. But all these historical references are on all the sides are remade in the course of this current conflict. So I just wanted to highlight that this conflict around Lasanod and around the question, do we belong to Somaliland? Do we belong to Somalia? This has a very long history, and it was quite visible already 20 years ago. Then I'm not going to go through all the details of this conflict. I mean, for some period in 2003, Puntland, from 2003 to 2007, Puntland controlled Lasanod. Lasanod is simply the center of the Dulbahante territories. And it's the most strategic place in the whole eastern regions. As you can see, this is also the only place where a tarmac road is running through. So that's why Lasanod stands for basically all the problems in the east. I mean, you could even go up to the Warsangili territories, to Baran. It has a similarly complicated political position between Puntland and Somaliland, or it at least had this kind of position for many, many years. But nobody really talks about Baran, because it's a Warsangili center, but it is strategically not. It's very difficult to reach. I mean, by now there is some road between Baran and Bosaso, But in 2002 and many years later, there was actually no proper connection even between Burao and Edigabo, and then from Edigabo to Baran. I mean, it's just so difficult to reach there that this is not a place where, you know, you would clash over who controls the area. But Lasanod is a strategic place. It's where all the business is running through from the south to the north, or from the north to the southeast. So that's why Lasanod, in a way, stands for this whole conflict in the east, I would argue. So anyway, from 2003 to 2007, Puntland controlled Lasanod. Then in 2007, now also supported by the then Ethiopian government under still Meles Zenawi, you know, the Somaliland forces took control of Lasanod. I'm sparing you the details why this happened. In a sense, the idea was that Puntland was not really securing the area. It was also not securing the borders between Somaliland / Northern Somalia and Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian government was concerned about arms smuggling from Yemen through northern Somalia into the Ogaden for the Ogaden liberation movement. And so, I mean, with the consent of the government in Addis Ababa, the forces from Somaliland moved into Lasanod in fall 2007. And from then onwards until actually January 2023, controlled Lasanod militarily. And now it's important to understand these kind of details. So the first reaction of the local population in 2007, when Somaliland forces captured Lasanod, was that like 80% of the city's population left, right? I mean, there was a huge evacuation. And this was not because the Somaliland forces were militarily attacking Lasanod. You know, actually the takeover was not so violent. There was like, because there was a small group of Dulbahante which were kind of scouting for the Somaliland army. So the Dulbahante forces entered Lasanod. There was some kind of resistance from other Dulbahante forces in town. So there were some skirmishes between actually Dulbahante, one group fighting for Somaliland, the other group fighting against Somaliland, but it was not a full-blown military operation between the Puntland army and the Somaliland army. It was a very low-scale skirmish between clan militias allied to either Somaliland or Puntland, and eventually the Somaliland forces entered the town, and people were leaving on the one hand, of course, because they were afraid of some kind of bigger military clashes, but also in demonstration of their rejection of Somaliland domination. And particularly, and this is really important, particularly the traditional authorities of, you know, like all the Dulbahante lineages, subclans and lineages, they left. And again, they met actually in Boame, in this tiny place not far from Garowe, and produced a Boame declaration, I think in early 2008, maybe in February 2008, in which they clearly stated all the points which were in a way reiterated in 2023 against Somaliland. They said, this is our land. We are not accepting the domination of the Somaliland army / ISAC, which is how local peoples are reading it. So they do not call it Somaliland army, but they call it ISAC army. So we are not accepting this kind of foreign or domination by another clan. We want to be part of Somalia. We want to be autonomous. We want to be autonomous in the area, and we want to be in the future part of Somalia. So in essence, this was a message of the Boame Declaration in early 2008, which was signed by all, I mean, like 90% of the important traditional leaders of Dulbahante. No, in those days, it was simply ignored because Somaliland was without any question a powerful actor. It had become a powerful actor. The democratization process had also proceeded quite well. The international community had changed its attitude towards Somaliland, also against the backdrop of, you know, the new violence unfolding in Somalia with Al-Shabaab, you know, taking center stage from 2007 onwards. So Somaliland in a way became really the good Somalia, if you like, with a lot of international organizations also opening an office in Hargeisa, and many projects for Somalia actually be remote controlled from Somaliland, from Hargeisa. So Somaliland was considered terror-free and was considered stable and really increasingly democratic, though actually international actors didn't really have a big problem with Somaliland forces capturing Lasanod in 2007, and then in early 2008, they also didn't listen to the declaration of the traditional authorities from the Dulbahante clan in Boame. So again, we can jump a few years forward that, during this Somaliland occupation, there was the first couple of years, there was quite a bit of insecurity in Lasanod. I visited the place several times. People were concerned about anonymous killings, from 2009 onwards. People complained about the harsh military administration of Somaliland and so on and so forth. There was actually no investments ongoing for many, many years. Lasanod remained the same in my eyes from 2002 until 2010, roughly 2010, 2011. Then when I returned, I could see that there's now some changes in the infrastructure. The university was built, there was a new prison, there were new government buildings. I mean, you could see that Somaliland started actually to invest a little bit, and people also did not complain so much anymore about the targeted killings. They were still ongoing, but they were not as frequent anymore as they used to be from 2009 to 2010, 11 onwards. And but still, I mean, Dulbahante were not really happy with Somaliland domination, at least quite a few Dulbahante who had remained outside of Lasanod. I mean, some of those people who had fled in 2007 never really returned. They went to, places like Garowe in Puntland or Buhotle or somewhere in the countryside around Lasanod. And some of these actors had actively tried to resist Somaliland's occupation of their areas. There was a first Sulsanak and Ain movement founded in 2009. It just operated in the Hout area, around Buhotle, between Buhotle and Lasanod mostly. It was not very successful. There were a couple of skirmishes between Somaliland forces and SSC forces back then. Somaliland forces always, were victorious in those days. There was even a massacre around Kalshale, which is, nobody really knows about it, but for locals, it was a really big issue where around 100 Dulbahante got killed in fighting the Somaliland army. And by now, there's a big monument, a memorial in Buhotle, which remembers the Kalshale massacre, as it's called. Though again, the international community really didn't take notice. For most actors in the region, it was not significant. And then Khaatumo was established as a more significant autonomous administration for Dulbahante in 2012, while actually Somaliland was controlling the area. Many intellectuals and also traditional authorities were kind of gathering in a place called Telech, which you also can see on the map, and declared the Khaatumo state of Somalia, which then actually, interestingly, fought against Puntland and Somaliland. Why did they fight against Puntland? Actually, with Puntland, they had some clan ties. So typically, Puntland is controlled by a clan called Machaten, and Dulbahante and also Warsingili and Machaten formed together the Harti clan confederation, if you like. But Khaatumo was fighting with Puntland and Somaliland, and it fought against Puntland because most Dulbahante who were against Somaliland were disappointed that Puntland didn't come and help them. So the Puntland administration was supposed to be like the big brother with the army. They were supposed to kick Somaliland out of Lasanod, and they didn't do it. And that's why the Khaatumo forces, which were established in 2012, also fought against Puntland, but mainly they focused on getting rid of Somaliland in Dulbahante lands. Again, this project failed. In 2015, the fighting between the Khaatumo forces and particularly Somaliland forces stopped. There was a new chairman of Khaatumo called Ali Khalif Galait, a former politician, a Dulbahante politician, also at one point a prime minister of Somalia, and who was the last chairman of Khaatumo, and he was a good friend of then president of Somaliland, Ahmed Silanyo. So they were having the idea that to solve this problem, they were refraining from military confrontations, and they would negotiate some kind of new agreement between the ISAC in the center and particularly the oppositional groups in the east. However, these negotiations failed eventually. I mean, they came to some kind of conclusion in October 2017, but this was just at the end of the term of President Silanyo. In November 2018, but 2017, Silanyo's term ended, and the current president, Musa Bihi, took over. And with the takeover of Musa Bihi, the agreement between Ali Khalif Galait and Silanyo was basically, put into the shelf, and the shelf was closed. So this agreement, what I honestly have to say, I tried to figure out what exactly was written in this agreement, because many people refer to it as a last chance, to have a peaceful solution between particularly Dulbahante in the east and the center administration of Somaliland. Many people now speak about it as a last chance. I never saw this document, unluckily, until now. But regardless of whatever was written there, Musa Bihi actually didn't honor it as a new president of Somaliland. To the contrary, he actually took the first military steps in early 2018. He actually marched with the troops from Somaliland, from Lasanod direction Garowe, and he, for the first time in almost 30 years, reached actually the border, the former colonial border, which is just 15 to 20 kilometers away from Garowe. Though Garowe became the government of Punta, and Garowe became extremely concerned about the Somaliland forces approaching the capital city. This actually caused some international concern, and even the UN and many donors felt the urge to ask Musa Bihi to retreat with his forces to a place called Tukarak, which is just halfway between Garowe and Lasanod. So anyway, the military expansionism of Musa Bihi was quite clear from then onwards. And I had the feeling when I was visiting Lasanod the last time, it was in 2018, the last time before this year, that most people in the town had actually made their peace with this, increasingly dominant and powerful Somaliland administration. And then when actually an uprising started in end of December 2022, many people were taken by surprise. So including myself, I was also taken by surprise that there was an assassination of a locally famous young politician who was part of the opposition party, Wadani, in Somaliland. So he was assassinated on 26th of December 2022. This was followed by protests, by civilian protests in the town. And then, from 27th, 28th of December 2022 onwards until the first days of January, the Somaliland administration in Lasanod started to use the rapid reaction units. I mean, a special police force, which is actually financed or trained by the UK and other police forces, to curb the uprising or to curb the demonstrations, to stop the demonstrations in Lasanod. And in this context, they started shooting civilians, killing around 20, mostly young people, and injuring many more. We can go now in the micro-sociology of violence, but, this triggered like more and more resistance. I heard at one point on 4th of January 2023, a member of the forces of a local cat dealer called Mohammed Jabatawi was killed by the Somaliland police during a control in the street. And then the body of this killed guy was not removed for burial, but the Somaliland forces for whatever reasons, wanted to keep him on this laying in the street as a demonstration. The Red Crescent, respectively, the Red Crescent actually collected the body eventually, and this caused a huge outrage on top of the already ongoing demonstrations. And the cut dealer Mohammed Jabatawi and his people, took up arms and also handed arms to others in the town who were ready to fight Somaliland, which then actually forced the Somaliland administration and its security troops to leave town. Or they took the decision on 5th of January to leave Lasanod, to retreat, which was by then, it was a way of avoiding bloodshed for sure. That's also how the Somaliland administration rationalized it. And then in the next couple of weeks, traditional authorities who had left Lasanod when Somaliland forces were taking over in 2007 returned to town for the first time in 15 years. And each traditional authority returning to town brought with him his staff, armed clan militias. So within a relatively short time, and kind of a Dulbahante clan militia emerged, a nucleus of a Dulbahante clan militia emerged in Lasanod, while actually the argument towards Somaliland and also towards others was we are going to negotiate in town about what we actually want. After this uprising and after the shooting of the civilians and after the confrontation between local armed people and the Somaliland forces, the official announcement was now Dulbahante have to meet and have to discuss their political future. And in a way, this was really a repetition of all the previous events when Dulbahante were sitting together and reflecting on their political visions. And the result was always, we don't want to be part of Somaliland. This had happened in 1993 in Boame. This had happened at many other local meetings of Dulbahante in the years afterwards, which I didn't mention. This happened in 2008, when people met again in Boame and declared, we don't accept Somaliland domination in our territories. And then now we are in January 2023, and again, Dulbahante traditional authorities and their people are saying, we are discussing our future. And it was absolutely clear, honestly, to me, that the result can only be, we want to be freed from Somaliland. And the declaration was supposed to be published on 6th of February 2023. Somaliland forces stationed around Lasanod. The Minister of Interior, Mohammed Kahin, actually in Lasanod, in Hotel Hamdi, he was supposed to be, well informed about what was ongoing. He had, historically a lot of ties to people in Lasanod. However, I don't know exactly what he knew and what he thought. I think it was absolutely clear that the declaration would say, we want to be freed from Somaliland. On the morning of the, 6 o'clock in the morning, 6th of February 2023, when the declaration was about to be read, the Somaliland forces started bombarding Lasanod. And from then on, it was really an escalation, in a very short time. It was clear that the militias, which had come with the traditional authorities to Lasanod, were providing for first resistance. I mean, on 6th of February and the days afterwards, the Somaliland forces stationed around Lasanod not only bombarded the town, but actually also tried to capture the town. They were stationed not really outside of the city, but partly even inside of the city. In the eastern part of Lasanod, there was around Hotel Hamdi, where the Minister of Interior, Mohammed Kain, was, there was a strong military presence, though the first days of fighting took actually place in town, in the east of town, particularly, and from outside, the town was shelled. So there was quite devastating destruction and also a lot of people killed and injured in Lasanod. And on 6th of February, the town was still full of civilians, right? I mean, there were roughly 180,000 inhabitants. Most of them fled within the first 2 days of the fighting. So who remained in town were those people ready to fight, the militias who had come with the traditional authorities, others who were taking up guns then, and of course, a few, men who wanted to guard their property, their houses, women who wanted to serve the troops, who were providing food or working as nurses and so on. The medical staff was remaining in town. Some of the workers, from the electricity plant and so on, were remaining in town. And some ordinary people, as I said, I have some friends who remained throughout the months of fighting in town just in order to make sure nothing happens to their house, to help some of their children who were working as nurses in the hospitals and so on and so forth. So, but, the bulk of people who, like from 8th of February, was in town, was ready to fight Somaliland. And then within a very short time, this rather disorganized clan resistance became a full-blown militia, which was really almost on eye level with Somaliland forces. So how did this happen? I think it sounds a bit gruesome, but what I heard from people around Lasanod, also from people in Puntland, they said initially it was a Dulbahante affair, but when enough Dulbahante become victims of the Somaliland aggression, then others will come. Machetin will come, Warsangili will come, Dishisha will come. All the Harti will eventually come and support Dulbahante. However, first, Dulbahante have to show that they are ready to fight and die for, for the independence, if you like. And this is exactly really what happened. So throughout February, there were, several quite brutal battles between the Dulbahante militias in town and the Somaliland forces in and around Lasanod. In the first couple of battles, the Somaliland forces were actually driven out of the east of Lasanod. They took positions literally 5 kilometers away from the borders of the town. And then there were kind of several attempts of the Somaliland forces to retake parts of the town, to attack the town. So there were a couple of battles of resistance. Then there was even one force which was still part of the Somaliland army, but it was commanded by a Dulbahante colonel called Mahat Ambashe. This force remained literally during the fighting inside Lasanod. So there were like 200 fighters who were all Dulbahante, but they were officially part of the Somaliland army and they never denied it. So during the fighting, these guys were sitting in the middle of town. They had heavy arms. And on, I believe it was on 24th or 25th of February, the Dulbahante who were actually resisting Somaliland were attacking their own brothers, the troops of Ina Ambashe, to drive them out of town. I think the traditional authorities had previously spoken with Mahat Ambashe and said, either you join us or you leave town. If you don't leave town, we are going to attack you. So the attack happened. It was a very brutal battle with a lot of people killed and injured, and they were all Dulbahante fighting each other. And after 25th of February, Lasanod was basically fully controlled by Dulbahante militias. Until then, literally hundreds had died and had been injured. Though this was the moment when then the other Harti forces came. So enough Dulbahante had suffered, enough blood was spilled. Dulbahante had shown that they are ready to fight for their independence. And then, various Macheteen and Warsangeli and Dishishe and other brothers came to support the fighting forces. And then within relatively short time, the maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 Dulbahante militias were reinforced by other Harti, by other Dulbahante fighters, mostly nomadic fighters actually, who came from the area around Buhat and other places in the Dulbahante territories. And by, I would say, mid of March, you had roughly 8,000 militia fighters defending Lasanod against roughly 10,000 Somaliland forces attacking Lasanod. So, and finally, there was, still bombardment ongoing. The Lasanod hospital was hit and so on several times. The Doctors Without Borders retreated from Lasanod in May due to the, insecurity and so on. There were quite a few dramatic moments. The most dramatic was, of course, 25th of August, when the SSC forces attacked the Somaliland positions around Lasanod, and actually within hours achieved something which had never been achieved in the months before. Within hours, they were actually evicting the Somaliland forces from all their positions around Lasanod and driving them not only away from Lasanod, but actually literally driving them out of the whole Dulbahante inhabited areas. So this happened on 25th of August within, let's say, 7 hours. And it's quite remarkable. It's, of course, also the question, how could this happen? Of course, it happened also because the fighting against Lasanod was contested within Somaliland. So not everybody, not all the people who actually were supporting the existence of Somaliland were in agreement with Musa Bihi's violent attack against Lasanod. So there was an internal Isaac opposition, if you like, and this weakened the Somaliland army for sure. The Somaliland army at the end of the day is also divided between different clans, Isaac clans, and I think there was a suspicion that certain clans positioned around Lasanod would not be ready to continue the fighting. So when this attack happened on 25th of August, the victory was due to, on the one hand, of course, the concerted and well-organized attack of Harti forces against Somaliland army. But on the other hand, a factor was also that Somaliland was fragmented, already politically fragmented, and the army suffered from this fragmentation and was probably weaker than it had been several months before. So in all, I would say this fighting, I mean, this is just my counting. I had been in contact with hospitals in Lasanod particularly, but I also had some informants in the Somaliland armed forces. So all in all, I would say that roughly 5,000 people were killed or injured on all sides. So if that's true, then it's one of the most dramatic conflicts Somalia has seen in the last couple of years. So now let's go to the present. Shortly, I mean, already during the fighting, a new administration was built up, the SSC administration, Sultan Ein, and you notice, I mean, the first time the Sultan Ein was established was in 2009. Then Khaatumo was established 2012. Now in 2023, we have a new SSC administration, which here, as you can see on this image, was headed, during the periods of the fighting by traditional authorities. All of them are so-called garats of various Dulbahante lineages. There you have a relatively young man who is a mayor of town, who was actually elected during the last parliamentary elections in Somaliland in 2021. So he was part of the Somaliland administration controlling Lasanod, but in January he switched sides and joined the SSC rebels. And he was accepted by the traditional authorities, so he continued to be the mayor of Lasanod. Then on the bottom you see an image of clan militias who were all, by the way, organized within, the segmentary structure, so to say. They were financed by lineages, by families. They were equipped by their own families. So they were basically all the subdivisions of the Dulbahante clan, plus also Fikishini and some others, minority groups. They were all kind of contributing to this common struggle by financing and equipping their own family militias. So all of that together produced a huge militia, which in a way was essentially a segmentary resistance movement, if you like. After 25th of August, a new administration was established. Actually, it was established already a few days before, and then it took, it took over like on 25th of August. A new traditional administration was forged, led by Abdul Virgil, who is the current leader of SSC-Khaatumo. It's called SSC-Khaatumo now. There was also a new police force established, after the Somaliland forces had been driven away from Dulbahante territories, in order to keep, peace and stability in Lasanod particularly. One has to say that during the time of fighting, insecurity, there was some insecurity in Lasanod. There was, smuggling of alcohol and so on and so forth. And it was one of the first measures of the new administration under Abdul Virgil, that a police force would control the peace in Lasanod and would also get rid of all the illegal activities. Quite interestingly, a delegation led by Abdul Virgil went to Mogadishu in October, discussing with the Prime Minister, with the Ministry of Interior. After around 10 days in Mogadishu, the Minister of Interior of Somalia announced that the federal government in Mogadishu is supporting SSC-Khaatumo. So they didn't say it's a new federal member state, but they said we are going to provide, humanitarian assistance. We are respecting those people fighting for Somali unity. So it was, a moral victory for sure. If it manifests in humanitarian aid, it's a question up until today. Of course, you could imagine that there would be some tensions within this newly established SSC-Khaatumo administration. I mean, Dulbahante have always been notorious for infighting, actually, over the last decades, even before that. Apart from maybe some minor misunderstandings between some traditional authorities, the current uprising and the rebellion against Somaliland really united Dulbahante, and minor misunderstandings didn't unfold the potential to fragment the resistance. So up until today, I would say that, interestingly enough, the common enemy, which is part of the segmentary logic, of course, the common enemy unites Dulbahante to a degree which has never existed in the years before, in decades actually before. So what is now the very current situation in the last 2 weeks? A new frontline has been established, which is now really separating the Dulbahante territories from the Isaac territories. This frontline is running, between Yele and between Gumays and Oog, actually. And there was a couple of skirmishes around this front line in the last 2 weeks, particularly in the area of Yele and Megagle, which are very small places, in the Haut region. The important aspect of these skirmishes is that, of course, the legitimacy of the Dulbahante resistance is we want to control our area. So if they would overstep the front line, this narrative would lose its value, right? I mean, if they would overstep in the front line and enter into Isaac inhabited territory, the Dulbahante would change from defenders into aggressors. And of course, on the other side, Mohammed Musa Bihi and his government, which had been defeated on 25th of August, they were quite interested that Dulbahante would overstep and would actually start attacking Isaac villages in order to create some kind of insecurity in this nomadic area. You know, the Hout area south of Oog is essentially a nomadic area. And of course, nomads are armed. So if you can transform the struggle of the SSC-Khaatumo forces against Somaliland forces into a struggle of some Dulbahante subclans against some Isaac subclans, then, you know, you create a persistent insecurity which eventually can weaken SSC. So this, I think, is the rationale of the current government in Hargeisa. And therefore, these skirmishes around Yele and Megagle were actually had a quite important political, had an important political dimension. So luckily for the last 5-6 days, there was no fighting. So traditional authorities, particularly from Dulbahante, went to the area in order to start negotiations between Isaac, you know, local Isaac and militias and the Dulbahante forces along the front line. But it's a very volatile situation. I'm not going to speak much now about this internal build-up of this current SSC-Khaatumo administration. It's still very fragile, for sure. It's still just in the beginning. It was literally established 3 months ago, and it's in the making. Today, actually, on 28th of November 2023, the first time the Khaatumo administration, SSC-Khaatumo administration, started to collect taxes, which is an important step towards, creating some economic revenue. So they were taxing, imports into Lasanod, along the tarmac road coming from Garowe, and also taxing the cat, which is delivered to Lasanod airport, which is a very small airport, but nevertheless, it's where the cat planes land. So cat is a big business in the area, of course. Luckily, there has been abundant rainfall in the last couple of weeks in the area. So, against many expectations, the most recent rainy season in October was relatively abundant. And there is what Somalis would say barwako, so there's plenty. However, still, parts of Lasanod is still destroyed. There's no large-scale assistance coming from outside. It's mostly in the hand of the Dulbahante diaspora to assist with rebuilding. Of course, the economy has been weakened by the war efforts. So first of all, Lasanod was never really a big economic hub. And second of all, the family resources in the last months have been channeled into the war effort, into the uprising and the rebellion against Somaliland. So currently, there's joblessness, there is, family resources have been drained. And there's still a destroyed infrastructure in Lasanod, which needs to be rebuilt. And there's no big international actor coming to assist the Dulbahante in Lasanod and surroundings. Nevertheless, they are on the way to continue their administration. Now, the question is, what is going to happen in the north now? Of course, Musa Bihi's government in Somaliland has really suffered from a tremendous defeat, on 25th of August, of course, but already the operation, against Lasanod in the months before was not very popular. There was huge internal opposition against Musa Bihi, growing the longer the attacks on Lasanod lasted. The current power elite in Lasanod seems to be also really old. Mohammed Kahin, the Minister of Interior, Sada Bangal, the chairperson of the Gurti, of the House of the Upper House, Musa Bihi, they are all former SNM, colonels from the 1980s, though they are well in their 70s, the late 70s partly. So they seem to cling to power. Also, of course, the economy for the fighting of the Somaliland forces against Lasanod, the economy suffered, and Somaliland's economy suffered. A lot of resources were pumped into the war. The military obviously was not as strong as some external observers and also maybe some Isaac and Somaliland supporters believed. So, I mean, eventually the Somaliland army suffered a crushing defeat on 25th of August, and a lot of heavy equipment was actually looted by Dulbahante and Hati forces. And so an interim conclusion could be that it's really a very uncertain situation for Somaliland. The internal opposition is huge. Many demand Musa Bihi actually to hold elections, until end of 2024, and it's clear that he's going to lose these elections. I just heard that a few days ago, Sale Bangal, who's really a close ally of Musa Bihi, said no elections are going to take place. So we are in a situation of war. We are not going to hold elections. If this would be really the position of the current government, then this is likely provoking much more opposition from within, or more resistance against the government from within Isaac, actually, because I think Musa Bihi has been a disappointment for very many Isaac. So, I mean, Somaliland is facing a very, very big insecurity at the moment, which is, of course, which has been triggered by what has happened around Lasanod, but it's also, fueled by the leadership style of Musa Bihi and his government. I mean, another factor which I can only, touch upon very briefly is that Puntland has been, of course, supporting the SSC uprising tremendously. I mean, in contrast to what happened previously in 2012, when, Khaatumo forces were fighting against Puntland, the current president of Puntland, Seceed Abdullahi Deni, had very cleverly played his parts. He had initially always said, I'm going to support the uprising, I'm going to support civilians, Somali civilians in Lasanod against the oppression of Somaliland, but he never anyway provoked any military confrontation between Puntland and Somaliland. He always denied that some Puntland military would be involved in Lasanod, but he always emphasized that morally and humanitarian, it was regarding humanitarian affairs, he is supporting the residents of Lasanod attacked by Somaliland. Under the cover, of course, a lot of military and other support came from Puntland to those people uprising in Lasanod. As I said, from mid-March onwards, a lot of militias, clan militias came from other Hati clans, but many of these clan militias coming to support the uprising in Lasanod were actually parts of the Puntland military. But Deni always denied that Puntland is officially involved, which of course also was strategically, a strategic position to avoid any official clashes between Puntland and Somaliland, because then the Lasanod uprising would have lost its legitimacy also in the eyes of the international community. However, at this very moment, Puntland is in a deep political crisis, and this is, it's unclear what the implications of this crisis will be for the SSC-Khaatumo administration, because the term of Deni ends on 8th of January, in a few weeks actually, and it's not clear yet how the presidential elections shall take place, because a multi-party system was introduced in Puntland in May. I mean, of course, it was legally already established many years before, but in May, communal elections took place in Puntland. A couple of parties emerged as those which are supposed now to contend for the parliament, and then the parliamentarians are going to elect the president according to this new system. But Deni is, he argues that we do not have enough time to complete the electoral process, so he wants an extension. He wants an extension for 1 year, and the opposition rejects it, and the whole thing has to somehow be decided literally in the next days, because the term of Deni ends on 8th of January. So it's really unclear what's going to happen in Puntland. And as you could expect, probably there's armed opposition forming in Puntland, in the center of Puntland and Garowe. So there's the so-called opposition, they have also arms at their disposal. There has been already some clash between the president and the opposition in June. And this has not been resolved. So there is a certain potential that Puntland is facing really tough times in the next couple of weeks, maybe even days, unless this very serious political conflict in the center of Puntland is going to be resolved. And interestingly, at this very moment, as we speak, some Dulbahante, traditional leaders are in Garowe in order to offer, their services as mediators. So we will see how this goes. So the conclusion, just in a nutshell, is that what we could see in a way, I think, as a social anthropologist, the segmentary lineage at work. So, I mean, the uprising against Somaliland in Lasanod, at least from a Lasanod perspective, from a Dulbahante perspective, it was very much a lineage and a clan affair. Though in essence, you had a clan fighting against Somaliland, which was considered the administration of another clan, like Dulbahante versus Isaac. So in this competition, in this conflict, Dulbahante united. For the first time ever, they really united, in the face of an overpowerful Somaliland military, which was attacking them. So in a way, you could say even Musa Bishi did a big service to the uprising. When on 6th of February he started attacking Lasanod, he really united Dulbahante, no matter what. There was a huge, and then of course, as I tried to explain, the more Dulbahante suffered, the more, the other clan brothers from the Hati Clan Federation felt compelled to support them. So until mid of March, when then really not only humanitarian support came, or logistic support came, but when actually also Machete and Dishisho or Singeli militias in their hundreds joined the Dulbahante fight. So this is in a way like a case study, of segmentary system in a conflict situation. So fusion, everybody who believes in the patri line to belong to the same forefather unites against a common enemy. So at least from a local Dulbahante perspective, it was like that. Another thing which was, of course, new and quite impressive was the transnational mobilization for the war. On the one hand, you had a Somaliland army, which was fully equipped and, it had a budget, as part of the state budget of Somaliland. It was, of course, well financed. And Somaliland had a huge economic success in the last couple of years. I mean, through the port of Berbera and the Berbera corridor and so on and so forth. So the Somaliland army was supposedly well equipped and well financed. In order to face it, the diaspora, Dulbahante diaspora, but actually the whole Harti diaspora from London, from Washington, from Berlin, from wherever, they were literally every month pumping millions into, the uprising, and they created something very close to a local army, right? I mean, initially it was just a few guys with arms, then it was a small militia, and eventually you had around 8,000 forces under arms, and a relatively good organized command structure at the end. And this was, hugely supported from diaspora around the globe. Then, of course, the social media dimension of this whole conflict, I'm not going into details here for the sake of time. And then one thing which I just wanted to propose, at the end of the day, what happened also, apart from the obvious, political conflict, what happened is you had a Somaliland system, which is in a way a state system, right? I mean, there was a democratic transition in the early 2000s. Somaliland exists in the last 20 years as a proper de facto state. It's very close to be like a state. It is actually like a state, but it lacks international recognition. And the command structures and the political system is like a state system. On the Dulbahante side, and including the Harti side, but mostly Dulbahante, it's like a traditional system. Like the guys who are calling the shots are the traditional leaders, the elders, and this is also how the whole administration is currently structured. The whole militia was structured like this, or is still structured like that. And the administration, SSC-Khaatumo, is structured like a classical traditional system. It has nothing to do with a multi-party democracy or anything like that. It's elders and it's representatives of lineages who are kind of cooperating in a consensus-based system to form resistance, to form an administration, and now currently to try to form something like a federal member state of Somalia. So in a way, you have a government system, a state system, fighting with a traditional system in the area around, in what was Eastern Somaliland and is currently SSC-Khaatumo. I think we can stop here. Thank you very much.